Okay, here's where we are. Hebrews 4:15 is the verse we're getting through. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. And I reminded you where we first saw this, and I started this conversation in Hebrews 2. He was made like his brothers in every respect so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. And that's where we're going to be focusing now. We've gone through the sin question because he has been tempted as we are without sin. Could Jesus have sinned when he was tempted? No, theologically. And again, every time I answer these questions like this, I always add that. This is a theological question. It's not a practical question. We can't really answer the practical question. This is all theological development. So no, theologically. So if he couldn't sin, could he be tempted? If you're unable to sin, can you be tempted? So that's the question we're answering today. Just reminding that it's not just here that it says he was without sin. There are other places we have where Paul and the writer of 1 John tells us that he had no sin. He knew no sin. So we answered this question last week. We went through the Old Testament, chata, to miss the mark, to miss a target. That's what the word for sin in the Old Testament means. That's the best example of that being thinking of archery, where you have a bullseye. If you shoot an arrow and you don't hit the bullseye, you have failed. You have missed the mark. That's what the word sin means in the Old Testament. We'll see in a second it's the same in the New Testament. We went through this verse because this is the best example in the Bible, in my opinion, of a setup for what sin is. Here Cain offers his sacrifice, and he is moved to second place with his brother. And at that point, it wasn't his sacrifice, we talked about this, that was the sin. The sin came after he got upset about his sacrifice not being accepted. And that's when the sin that was crouching at the door was fulfilled. When he became angry, his face fell, and then obviously when he killed his brother. So in the New Testament, hamartano, same meaning, same idea. And then this verse in the New Testament pretty much says exactly what sin is, that whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it has committed sin. And our notions of sin, what we call sin, the thing that is sin to us, really doesn't apply, because the whole point of sin, what sin is the violation of the order God created. What God specified he wanted man to do and be, when you get outside of that, it's sin. That's what sin is. And so that verse in James saying, when you know what to do and you don't do it, that's sin. And God created us with a way, with this nature, to know what sin was alongside of the nature that we have to sin. So we've answered this question. Sin is the violation of the order God created. So since Jesus is God and is so described in Hebrews, so the writer of the Hebrews has told us already several times, from his perspective, Jesus is God. So that's the starting point that he's at in his argument. Since Jesus is God, he can't violate his own will. He can't get outside of the order God created, because he can't get outside of the order he created, because if he gets outside the order he created, it's impossible. You can't do that. So there's the argument that Jesus could not sin. Theologically, he He could not have sinned. The saying is trustworthy, for. So Paul, this is in 2 Timothy, this is one of those creeds that he's repeating within his text. And this makes the argument that I was just making, that Jesus can't get outside of the order God created. If we have died with him, we will also live with him. If we endure, now there's an idea we've talked about before, we've heard in the book of Hebrews. If we endure, we will also reign with him. If we deny him, he will also deny us. If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. That's the key that we're looking for here. Jesus can't deny himself. So the point here is that no matter what we do, he remains the same. Even if we are faithless, he remains faithful to us. For he cannot deny himself. What does for he cannot deny himself mean? It basically means he cannot be something he isn't, which is the argument that Jesus can't sin because he's God and he can't not be God. He can't be something he isn't. We've addressed sin. Now we have to address something else. Since he couldn't sin, was he really tempted? Theologically, again, yes. So how does that work? If you can't do something, how can you be tempted to do it? We answer that question the same way we answered the sin question. What is temptation? The way you think about this word is the problem. And the way you think about this word is somebody else's fault. What is temptation? Peirazō is the Greek word. And the definition of peirazō is to try whether a thing can be done. Now, what is the more common word for trying whether a thing can be done or not? Testing. So this is why I've told you before, when you see the word temptation, tempter in the New Testament, test is a much better word. Literally, temptation is a mistranslation in the 21st century. But they keep translating it tempt. And you'll see it 95% of the time in the New Testament, this word gets translated tempt. But there are a few places where if they translate it tempt, it won't make sense. And that's because if you translate it the way it's supposed to be translated, it makes sense. If you go back to the other 95% where they translate it tempt and change it to test, that still makes sense. When you see this word temptation, you need to stop just a second and swap the word out just to see if it makes sense. So here's the temptation itself that we often think about in this situation. The tempter, which was Satan, came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." So here Satan is tempting Jesus because Jesus is hungry to change rocks to bread. If we read this with the idea the tester came and said to him, does it hurt the translation? Well, that is technically what it does say. And I pointed this one out a week ago, where Paul says, "Examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves, or do you not realize this about yourselves, that Jesus Christ is in you, unless indeed you fail to meet the test." So guess which word this is? It's peirazō. So if this was translated the way they translated it most of the time, this would say, tempt yourselves. Does it make sense to say, tempt yourself? You think the New Testament instruction would be to tempt yourself. Well, if you think of temptation as the urge to do evil, would Paul here be saying, try to make yourself do evil? That's because that's not what the word means. So why do we think that's what it means? What have I Told you before. Translation is what? Interpretation. So every time you see this word temptation in the New Testament now, in the 21st century, you are being taught something. You are being preached to. Because the reason it stays temptation and doesn't change to test is because when it was first translated into English, in fact, through the time of the King James Version, the word tempt in English didn't mean what we think it means. It meant closer to the word test. In fact, you can see outside of the Bible in other literature of the time, a writer says something to the effect of, he tempted the waters, meaning he tested to see whether or not the water was too deep. In the older form of the language, tempt was a decent translation of this word. But because it's in the Bible over and over again in a context that involves sin, over the last 400 years, guess what we've done? We've changed the meaning of the word. It's become a religious word. And so testing with the context of sin around it means temptation. And so because of that, everybody who does translations into English these days is reluctant to change the word to what it really is because it's always been tempt. So all I'm really trying to get through to you here is when you see this word tempt in the New Testament, you got to stop and realize it's not just about sin. And in fact, as I'm about to try to demonstrate to you, it doesn't have anything to do with sin at all, because temptation doesn't involve sin. How does temptation work? Temptation comes over time. So temptation starts, and it starts small. You first realize you're being tempted, tested, tempted. And it grows, and it grows. It gets worse and worse as you go. It grows. How do you ever get temptation to stop? How can you stop temptation? The only way out of temptation is to give in to it. It's the only way. And then after that, what comes after you give in to temptation? It gets replaced by something else. What? Guilt. Because you gave in. So temptation is the desire to do evil. What is temptation? Temptation is not the desire to do evil. We're getting that somewhere else. Temptation is pressure toward disobedience. Remember what sin is. Sin is going outside the order that God created. Sin is disobedience. Temptation is the pressure toward disobedience. But it's not this thing inside of you that's sin that's trying to get out. It's the pressure you feel toward disobedience. Lots of things can cause temptation. These are pressures we feel toward disobedience. These things can cause us to move toward disobedience. And Jesus felt these things. So temptation comes, and it grows, and it grows, and the only way to make it stop is to surrender to it, because what happens if you don't surrender to it? It lingers. It's still there. It doesn't just leave because you're resisting it. It's always going to be there. If you have temptation, it will stay. It will stay with you. And the only way that we can say Jesus was really tempted is to accept the fact that temptation is something that doesn't forever go away. It will always be there. You can't just make it leave. It's not something that you can handle on your own and just get rid of. Sin is the violation of God's order, and temptation is the felt cost of obedience under pressure. So we've kind of flipped it around now. Not the presence of inner evil desire. So the word we understand today as tempt confuses us from what the original meaning of the word was, because now we have this notion of a presence of inner evil desire. That's what temptation is caused by. Really, temptation is the effect that we feel from our own nature, but it's not the sin itself. Temptation is not sin and has nothing to do with sin. Temptation is what you feel and the cost that you feel from not giving in to sin. Back to this verse. In every respect, he was tempted as we are, but without sin. Temptation has nothing to do with sin, but he did feel temptation. And his temptation was greater than any we've ever felt. Can you explain why? We escape temptation by yielding. And if you never yield, so he felt the fullest possible temptation you could ever feel because he never gave in. So there's your theological explanation for how Jesus couldn't sin and yet could still be more tempted than we've ever been tempted. Theologically. So I'm not offering it as a practical explanation. It's still something that is helpful to think about. And that's why this had to be explained, because we can't just sit around and let things not be explained and take them on faith. So, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. So we understand all of those points. And this word weaknesses here is properly translated. You have to think about this in terms of we have weaknesses. That's why we give in to temptation. And Jesus, by not giving in to temptation, still felt those weaknesses. He understands the weaknesses because he felt the temptation. That's how he can sympathize with our weaknesses and understand why we give in, even though he never did. Final verse in this chapter, which begins the discussion of chapter 5. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in the time of need. Jesus, having experienced this, allows us the opportunity to have him represent us before God with our weaknesses. In the King James Version, we're used to seeing this word here. Let us then boldly approach the throne of God. This word confidence here contains both of those elements. It is the word confidence, but it also has a public face to it. In the Gospels, this word you'll see this word a lot in the Gospels, and it gets translated with things like publicly and outwardly. And then for some reason, once we hit the book of Acts and the epistles, we start seeing the word confidence more. That it's the same word because it means both ideas. When you're confident, you are willing to step out publicly, and that's the idea here. This word is like that. So we should have within us the boldness to approach God's throne, because if we were approaching God's throne as our own representative, should we be bold? Not given the way we give in to our weaknesses. But we have someone representing us who can be bold because he didn't give in to those weaknesses. That's what this verse is talking about. He is our intermediary. He is our representative before God who understands and can sympathize with our weaknesses. He is assuming the role of high priest. The discussion going forward in chapter 5 is about the high priest and how Jesus is a high priest for us. What did the high priest do? Once a year, and this is where we'll begin in chapter 5. Once a year, he goes into the Holy of Holies, and what does he do? He stands in between God and all the sinners and offers a sacrifice to cover their sins. And that's what we have described here in this setup. Jesus, the intermediary, standing between us and God, sympathizing with our weaknesses.